So with that, with those remarks, I'll go ahead and get started. Just a little while ago at 10 a.m., our office released a spring fiscal outlook. As you know, that is an atypical product from us because typically we do a November fiscal outlook, and then in January and in May, we provide a lot of analysis and cover our view of the governor's budget proposal in January and the May revision in May. But given the extraordinary downturn that we're experiencing in California and the country as a response to the coronavirus, we felt it was important to provide the legislature with our estimate of an updated picture of the state's baseline budget situation as we go into this period in the coming weeks when the legislature will be charged with adopting a budget. That being said, there's a unusually high level of uncertainty at this time. The uncertainty is across multiple dimensions, more than the typical recession, in the sense that, you know, we have uncertainty about the course of the virus itself, and that's going to have economic and fiscal implications. Then there is even people's response psychologically and as far as their behavior as consumers and economic actors that will have an effect on the economy and on the state budget. And then, of course, there's the regular aspect of forecasting or trying to anticipate the trajectory of the economy, which even in normal times is very difficult. So with those uncertainties in mind, rather than try to land on one particular view, we wanted to give the legislature going into this an idea of what they could be up against. So we developed an economic and revenue forecast under two kind of economic scenarios. We're calling it the U-shaped scenario and the L-shaped scenario. The U-shape is that there's a sharp downturn that we are experiencing now, and that the economy will remain depressed for some period of time, but eventually will have a more robust kind of recovery. The other, the L-shaped scenario is one in which there's the downturn in a similar fashion, fairly sharp downturn, but then instead of you know, a low period and then a recovery, it's kind of a slower, more protracted period of slow growth or a very sluggish recovery that lasts actually for years. So those are the two scenarios that we looked at broadly. And just to get to the bottom line, because I'm sure a lot of people, that's you know, you're interested in, under our U-shaped economic scenario, we arrived at an estimated budget problem of 18 billion, and under an L-shaped scenario, we estimated a budget problem of 31 billion. Those, when we say budget problem, what we mean is that the state would not have enough revenue in the coming year, revenue and existing discretionary resources in the coming year to cover its existing commitments. Basically, we're looking at the budget under a current law and policy basis. Now, I know that the governor's office and the Department of Finance had a different number out yesterday. And what I'll say about that, and I'm going to limit what I say about that because we really haven't had an opportunity to go through that. We will, you know, of course, be analyzing the May revision when it comes out. But the thing that I'll say about it is that our fundamental view of the world is not that different. Whereas in their estimates that came out yesterday, they had a $41 billion revenue loss compared to January. Ours is 39 billion. So in the L-shaped scenario. So it's kind of a similar view under the governor's numbers in our L-shaped scenario. And I think where we differ is in some of the methodological aspects of how we measure the state's spending base and that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do is focus more on what we did, and then my colleague Ann Hollingshead, who is our analyst that is in charge of the She's assigned to the general fund, and she led the effort writing and assembling this report. She can provide, I think, a helpful walkthrough of how we arrived at our estimate. The thing that I'll say, though, just before even getting to that, is that we started with looking at the state's expenditure base on a current law and policy basis. What would it cost the state in the coming year and years to maintain the existing level of commitments that they've made? And there's some natural increases in costs related to inflation and caseload changes and population changes that cause that number to change over time. And that's what is the main driver of the expenditure changes from year to year in our forecast. And that's how we did it, okay? Now, along those lines, I think just as important as what our report does do, I think I should tell you what it does not do. We discourage readers from viewing our U and L-shaped scenarios as a best and worst case. Though instead, think of it as somewhat optimistic and somewhat pessimistic. We're trying to capture the bulk of the potential outcomes under the bell curve, essentially. So there could be reasonable outcomes that lie somewhat outside of what our U and L-shaped scenarios depict. The second point is, this is not to be viewed as an alternative budget proposal. This is very much more like a update to our fiscal outlook in November. And we will be going through and unpacking the governor's May revision as usual, but that really is the domain of the governor's office to put forward a proposal. And then finally, this document is not really the place to look for what we think are the main list of solutions that the legislature will have to eventually land on in order to solve this budget problem. We offer a few ideas on the margin where they could maintain the same the service level that is in law now, but at a lower cost. But that's not really going to be the main crux of solving this budget problem. Okay, so if that's what the report is not, the natural question is, well, what is it? And I have 4 points I'll leave you with, and then I'll turn it over to Ann. The first is that we think that this budget problem is going to require a mix of solutions. Fortunately, unlike the last time when the state went into a recession, the state enters this recession with very historically high level of reserves, and that really is a beneficial asset that it has going into this. That could allow the state to transition its expenditures to a lower level in a less disruptive manner. The other thing is, along with using the reserves, though, we think that the legislature will have to consider some expenditure adjustments. It may want to consider some revenue adjustments. And, as usual, there can be some cost shifting, moving costs out of the general fund, that sort of thing that are a little more technical. But, that's really the 4 legs of the stool: reserves, expenditures, revenues, and cost shifting. The second point, and this is very important, I really would hope to communicate this to you. This is unfortunately not going to be a one-time situation. It's not like this is a shock to the economy and a shock to the budget and that everything's going to go back to normal. Our analysis suggests that this is going to be a multiple-year problem. And, over the next several years, what we're really looking at is something that's more structural in nature. Our analysis shows kind of a recurring $20 billion problem under the U-shaped scenario, and something closer to a $30 billion problem under the L-shaped scenario. So somewhere in that range is what we're facing here. And that probably argues for the legislature to consider making some ongoing adjustments to the budget, which is very difficult. At the same time, we're suggesting that they consider that. There's a conundrum, because this is not your typical recession. This is a pandemic-induced recession. That means that the legislature will need to be strategic about the programmatic changes that it makes. They certainly wouldn't want to make changes to programs that could, in fact, exacerbate the public health crisis that we're dealing with. So, that's going to call for sort of a strategic approach. And then the last point that we would make is that there's been some discussion about, we can pass a placeholder budget in June and then tackle the rest of the problem in August. Once we have a better sense of what the revenues will be in July when the tax filing date comes, we would encourage the legislature to think strongly about beginning to tackle the problem in June. Deferring and waiting until August to solve this will compound the challenge with it. Some of the expenditure adjustments, for example, take time to take effect. And so by implementing those up front, it maximizes the budgetary benefit. And also it's just very difficult from a programmatic standpoint to make cuts on a mid-year basis for many program areas. So those are sort of my overview remarks. I think at this point, I'd like to pass the baton over to our lead author, Ann Hollingshead, and ask her to walk through sort of our little bit of additional detail that you might find interesting.
Thanks, Gabe. So I'm going to share my screen and I pull up a graphic. Let's see, I might try to zoom in a little bit. You can see that. Okay, so this is a sort of basic graphical depiction of the budget problem calculation under each of our two scenarios. So on the left side, we have that U-shaped scenario that Gabe mentioned, the somewhat optimistic scenario, and then on the right side, we have the L-shaped scenario, the somewhat pessimistic scenario. Both of these graphics are building toward the red bars on the right, so an $18 billion budget problem in the U-shape and a $31 billion budget problem in the L-shape. So on the left side of each of the graphics is stuff that makes you worse off, right? So lower revenues, higher costs. And then the blue bars are showing things that provide budgetary benefit, that are net offsets to those pink bars. So enhanced federal funding, for example. So essentially, if you start with the left, as Gabe already mentioned, we have lower revenues in our U scenario of $26 billion and $39 billion in our L-shaped scenario. In both, we assume higher COVID-related spending of $7 billion. And then each of these are offset by a few different things. And I will say this graphic kind of focuses on some of the more important ones, but there's billions and billions of dollars actually of additional changes that are kind of happening behind the scenes of each of these that, we don't display, but for kind of simplicity's sake, walk through some of the bigger ones. So in both cases, reserve deposits are lower under constitutional requirements. In both cases, we also assumed that the state would suspend its required deposit for 2020-21 under an available fiscal emergency. I'm happy to also talk about reserves a bit more if you all have questions about it. It is a pretty complicated issue, but it's one obviously of pretty serious import in solving the budget problem. So if you have questions, we should talk more about that. Then the next step is we assume that K-14 education under the Proposition 98 requirements, we don't, unlike sort of typical fiscal, assume that the state funds at the constitutional minimum for K-14 education, but rather that the state funds at the 2019-20 enacted level adjusted for inflation. So this is below what the governor's January proposal was, which is why there's a blue bar there, instead of just a zero, but it's not substantially lower as it would be were we to assume that they were funded at the constitutional minimum. And if you all have questions about that, also a very complicated one, and we have a couple other folks who can talk about that. Then the next one is more federal funding for Medicaid programs. So this is the enhanced federal match that was provided by Congress in recent legislation in the CARES Act and the FFCRA. Actually, I don't remember which of the two it was. I think it was one of the two. And that provides 6.2% percentage point increase in the federal cost share for Medicaid programs in the state, and results in roughly $6 billion in lower net costs. Now that's just the lower side. There's also kind of an offsetting higher side, right, where caseload, we're projecting caseload to go up in these programs, and so they do also have higher state costs, but this is just that federal piece. Then we assume, kind of consistent with what Gabe already said, we're assuming that the January proposals are not funded in this baseline projection because January proposals are not part of current law. Those are, just proposals. And so removing them benefits the budget by a few $billions. And then that lower net other is a very small bar, but there's actually kind of billions of dollars of movement happening in there. It's just canceling out each other out in both directions. So that's why that is there. I will also mention one thing that does not appear in this graphic, but is actually of pretty serious consequence to the budget's bottom line. And that is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This was $139 billion that Congress authorized for state and local governments to help address the costs of the public health emergency associated with COVID-19. The California state government is eligible for $9.5 billion of CRF funds. We did not assume that any of that money offset current costs because, we do have some guidance from the U.S. Department of the Treasury about how CRF can be used, but we're not honestly sure how much of it will be available for offsetting current costs versus not. But, although we assumed zero and we just kind of treated it like an on-off switch, the reality is going to be somewhere between 0 and $9.5 billion. And that would contribute to lowering the budget problem were it used in that way. So happy to take questions, or I can turn it back over to Gabe and then we can do some questions.
Okay, we have a question from Adam Beam. Gabe, if you had anything further? No. Okay. So,
I think he's muted, Mike.
okay, thank you.
There we go.
Sorry about that, Gabe.
No problem. Okay, Adam.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I know you said you didn't really want to get into a lot of the difference between your estimate and the governor's estimate. I was wondering if you could explain a little more what you mean by the net versus the gross. In the report, it mentioned that was one of the reasons why there was a difference. I was kind of unclear what you meant by that.
Yeah, okay. Would you want to take this one, Anne, or?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, honestly, our understanding of the numbers is still very much evolving, and we got them recently as well. So I don't want to go into too much detail lest I mischaracterize what the administration's numbers are. But kind of based on our understanding, if you kind of think back to the graphic, essentially they are doing some of the netting process that we do, where you look at the pink bars and the blue bars, but maybe not the same amount as we are doing. So for example, they count the January discretionary proposals as part of their baseline, whereas we don't treat them that way. So those are kind of some key differences in kind of thinking about it on a net basis versus a gross basis.
And there's an important point to that. We really view the spending base, the current law and policy spending base, as the baseline. We don't presume to know what the legislature will decide to appropriate going forward, and so we stop with what's in the current law, in the current budget. So that's sort of an important point, I think, that Anne references.
Okay. Let's see, Kevin Yamamura from Politico. Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, hey, thanks. Thanks for doing this. Just to follow up on that, has LAO traditionally used that current law approach? I mean, it seems like during the last downturn that approach was more typical in calculating these deficit sizes.
Yeah, generally, yes. So in our fiscal outlook, we obviously use the current law approach because the most recent budgetary document in the time of November is the June Budget Act. In May, in our May outlook process, we actually typically use the governor's May revision as the baseline. So it's not a current law approach, it's a governor's budget, governor's May revision baseline approach. They're actually, having recently looked back at old fiscal outlooks, there have actually been kind of a variety of approaches taken in deficit calculations about how you treat Proposition 98 minimum guarantee, how you treat federal funding, and those, kind of nuances in thinking through, the calculation of the budget deficit. But, yes, for the fiscal outlook, at least, yes, our approach is to generally take a current law and policy baseline.
Can I add, it seemed like you did deviate from that in at least two ways with Prop 98 and assuming the $7 billion in COVID response, right? I mean, that wasn't in current law. So were there other areas where you deviated from that that approach?
Those are the two, I believe. I can't think of any others.
Thanks.
Okay, let's see here. So Keely Webster from Bond Buyer. Go ahead, Keely. Keely, you might have to unmute.
Okay, there we go. I think I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Gabe, taking you back a couple of years when you were at S&P, we talked about, with the number of tax measures and propositions that the state had taken, you were saying, one of your cautionary notes was that the state wouldn't have a lot of room to increase taxes and raise revenues in the next recession as a result of what they've done. Do you still have that same opinion, or do you think the state has the capacity to raise taxes, particularly given, how much residents are going to be hurting as a result of the high, unemployment numbers?
Well, I think it's, kind of a political question that the policymakers will have to grapple with. I mean, making expenditure reductions or making tax increases when the economy is in a depressed condition, both of those measures, are sort of represent forms of austerity in a way that can be difficult, especially in a down economy. So that being said, I mean, I think at this point, the severity of this downturn is shaping up to be, at least in the initial phase, every bit as severe as the Great Recession. And I think the legislature is going to want to consider all of the tools in its toolbox. And, I think that's going to be part of the discussion that they'll have in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. We have Samantha from Kaiser from California Healthline.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for doing this briefing. You had said that the legislature might want to consider not making changes to programs that would exacerbate the problem. That, because previously, for those of us who were around, we certainly remember all the cuts that the lawmakers did make during the Great Recession to some of those safety net programs. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe drill down and give us a couple of examples of, or do you know of some examples that you might want to advise the legislature on which programs not to cut?
Well, the way we're thinking about this is that will be among the criteria that they have to weigh. When they look at the different options, on the one hand, they have a budget problem that they have to solve, which could include reducing expenditures. And when they go to, if that's part of the mix, then they're going to have to choose from among the different programs that the state funds and decide which programs to reduce. And my point about that was really just that they would need to be careful that whatever adjustments they make would not in any way undermine the state's capacity to combat the virus or to mitigate the public health emergency that we're still facing. So, I mean, I think it's just that's how I would frame that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, a follow-up question from Kevin Yamamura. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks. Gabe, I did want to go back to what you said toward the end of your remarks about the legislature passing some kind of a baseline budget. What exactly would that look like? Is that basically keeping programs at their current levels? What would that interim budget be before the July revenues come in?
Well, to begin with, in this exercise that we went through, we evaluated the cost of maintaining the existing service level, and then we went through, and within that, we looked at various areas where the same service level could be maintained, but perhaps at a somewhat lower cost by providing, for example, reduced or eliminate the COLA or pay increases for state workers, that sort of a thing. The size of the budget problem, though, is going to run up against any goal to, maintain sort of a workload budget or a placeholder budget, because the legislature is required to pass a balanced budget in June. And so, there will most likely have to be some material adjustments made in order to get there. So, that's really what we were saying in that point.
So, and then you suggested they would come back soon after that?
Well, I'm not suggesting it, but I've heard that, just in news articles and so forth, that, there had been some consideration that they would circle back later in the summer and revisit, depending on what the revenue picture looks like in July. And certainly that will be a time when we will have a clearer picture of what the state's fiscal situation is. But, but I'm not necessarily saying that that's what they should do by any means.
Okay, Adam Beam from the Associated Press with a follow-up. Go ahead, Adam.
Hi, thank you so much. I had two questions. One is on page 10 of the Outlook, when it lists kind of some reasons for the differences between the finance and LAO. One of the reasons given is says the administration's estimate of caseload-driven costs are higher by billions of dollars. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what those differences are and what the exact cost is, how many billions. And secondly, the other question I had was, the governor and legislative leaders have said that they really think they can't do this on their own, and the federal government's going to have to step in. I was wondering if you share that view as well.
It's Ann. I'll address the first one and then I'll defer the second one to Gabe. So I cannot actually share the exact precise numbers because we're still trying to understand, as I'm sure you saw their fiscal update, they referenced the $13 billion in total costs, including $6 billion in COVID and the remainder being caseload driven. We're still trying to understand exactly, what is included in that number. Is it net of, different federal offsets? Is, what programs are included? Is it only HHS programs? Is it also other programs, right? So we have, we just have to kind of nail down the answers to those questions in more detail before we can give precise numbers. But, just in kind of first blush, looking at the numbers, they look like they're billions of dollars different.
So is it a situation where they're saying $7 billion in caseload and you don't really have an estimate on that yet? Is there a $7 billion difference there right now, or?
No, we have an estimate on caseload. It's just a question of, exactly what is in that $7 billion cost, right?
Okay. What is your estimate on caseload? Is that in there somewhere?
I'm going to defer to Carolyn on whether or not we can give out that precise number.
Hi, this is Carolyn Chu from the LAO. We certainly can follow up if you have specific caseload questions. I think that one of the core challenges, we only have as much information as you all do from Finance's fiscal letter. When the administration's May revision comes out, we'll be able to compare much more precisely the differences in our estimates. You can see actually the specific agency by agency spending that we have in the back of the Outlook if you're curious on that, and we certainly could follow up on sort of the magnitude of the caseload changes. We do make, as you saw, likely a specific assumption about the duration of the increase in federal funding. And that's a significant offset to our increased costs in caseload, or increased costs due to caseload, I should say. So I think it's sort of hard to answer this question and go down this line of questioning until we can better understand what the administration has when they come out with the May revision.
Mm-hmm. And regarding the federal aid question, I mean, certainly, you know, additional federal aid would be helpful in two ways. First, it could be beneficial to the state fiscal condition, and it could also be beneficial to the economy, which would have, you know, it would reduce the hardship felt by Californians, but also help reduce the budgetary problem. And so, you know, our analysis here doesn't make an assumption about that. So, you know, our figures are you know, without regard to any potential future federal aid that may be coming. But certainly, it would be helpful to the situation if there were more.
Thank you.